So we had digital cameras, and we were trying to get photographs printed of Madeleine from the holiday, both to give to the police. But secondly, a very good friend of ours, who we spoke to in the early hours of the morning of the 4th of May, took it upon himself to issue photographs of Madeleine to all the major media outlets in the UK.
Within a very short space of time, the British press and perhaps the international press had descended on Praia de Luz, is that correct?
It is.
And you had to make a decision as to whether to interact with them, and if so, on what basis.
Yeah.
And what decision did you make, and why?
Well, the first thing to say, it was incredibly daunting. We had been away all day. It was also apparent to us, whilst we were in the police station in Portimao in the Algarve, that there was already fairly extensive coverage, particularly on Sky News, which was running in the police station, somewhat bizarrely. And when we were driving back towards the apartment, it was in the evening, and we could literally see tens, if not hundreds, of journalists outside the apartment, and satellite vans, etc., large number of cameras. And there were two things going through my head: is what they're going to be saying, and we've seen, I think, over many years, privacy being invaded and what stories could be published. But ultimately, possibly because we've seen the same thing being done in the UK, I thought it was an opportunity to issue an appeal. I was given no guidance one way or another whether to do that. I knew there could be a very heavy downside to interacting, but I made the decision at the time, with information I had, that it would probably be in the best interests of the search for our daughter, and decided to interact.
Yes. And you say in your statement, paragraph 15, that in the initial stages your engagement with the press worked well. Are you able to amplify that just a little bit for us, please?
I think for those people who can remember, it was a very unusual scenario, and we got a distinct impression that there was a genuine want to help attitude from the journalists there, and I think also many of the executives who perhaps saw what had happened to us, and there was a huge amount of empathy. So I really did feel early on there was a desire to help.
Yes. As you explain, the position changed, but the segue perhaps into that change is some evidence you give in relation to the Portuguese criminal system. Now, each culture, each nation has a slightly different criminal system, and obviously there can be no criticism about that. But what you say in Portugal is that there is no permitted interaction between the law enforcement agencies and the press. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And do you have a view as to the possible drawbacks of that, without necessarily being critical? But I think it's pretty obvious it gives rise to the possibility of leaks, doesn't it? Sure.
I think the system is open to abuse, is the first thing. Clearly, there was a ferocious appetite, and perhaps in the United Kingdom, where the SIO and the press office for the constabulary leading the investigation would have had a very clear agenda on how to work with the media, what information could be disclosed, what might be helpful, and steering journalists away from certain areas. Obviously, there was none of that happening, and there was tremendous pressure on the Portuguese authorities to interact with the media. And some of you may remember the very first time that happened, the spokesperson gave a short statement that didn't really say anything, was asked a number of questions, and followed every single one of them with, "I can't give you any details because of judicial secrecy."
Yes.
So there was a huge appetite, and we quickly realised that there was a tremendous amount of speculation in the coverage, both in the newspapers, and also you had 24-hour news channels there constantly, and we found that to be unhelpful.
In terms of the conduit type of information, is this correct, that whatever the strict legal position in Portugal, information was being leaked by the Portuguese police to the Portuguese press? That's stage one. then having been leaked to the Portuguese press, the British press then picked up on that self-same information at stage 2. Is that an accurate description?
I cannot tell you for certain that it was the Portuguese police who were leaking information, but for anyone who followed the headlines in July, August and September 2007, I think it would be a perfectly reasonable assumption to make that elements of the inquiry were speaking to the Portuguese police. I do not know if they were Portuguese press. I do not know whether they were speaking directly to the British media, but what we clearly saw were snippets of information which, as far as I was concerned, the British media could not tell whether it was true or not, which was then reported, often exaggerated and blown up into many tens, in fact hundreds of front-page headlines.
So the British press did not have the means of verifying the information, but your complaint is that the information was distorted and magnified. Have I got it right?
I think I'm complaining on all of the grounds that they didn't know the source, didn't know whether it was accurate, it was exaggerated and often downright untruthful, and often, I believe, on occasion was made up.
Well, we're going to cover the detail of that in a moment, Dr. McCann. Throughout the summer of 2007, the interest of the British press was retained in the story, wasn't it? They were constantly there in Praia de Luz. Is that right?
Yes, it did surprise us. Obviously, after the initial period, and I can understand that what we ended up doing by having an international campaign was unprecedented, but we did send a very clear signal as the attention focused more and more on Kate and myself that the focus should be on Madeleine, and we fully expected around mid-June for the British media to leave. We decided we had to stay in Portugal, to be close to Madeleine, to be close to the investigation, and it certainly didn't feel capable of leaving at that point. So it did surprise us that there was so much ongoing interest when there really wasn't very much happening.
In terms of the advice you were getting or not getting, again, to put to one side the issue of the PCC until a later sequence of new evidence, which you tell us in your witness statement that there were two resources available to you. Paragraph 21, first of all, someone from Bell Pottinger who gave you assistance. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, please, and the value that person was able to provide to you?
Yeah, so Alex Woolfall, who works for Bell Pottinger, was brought out really to deal with the media crisis management specialist on behalf of Mark Warner. And at that point, he was leading the engagement with the media who were present in Praia de Luz, and he was very helpful. He just gave us some simple tips, which we have tried to stick to, and that was, if you interact, what's your objective? Should be your question you ask yourself, and how is it going to help? And obviously our objective is to find Madeleine, and that is something that we have tried to apply when we interact with the media. Today is one of the exceptions where it's not the primary purpose of our engagement.
Thank you. And you also mentioned someone called Clarence Mitchell, who was seconded to the FCO as part of the media liaison in Praia de Luz, and you fairly say that person's help was invaluable. Is there anything that you would wish to add in relation to the assistance that person gave you?
I think at times we've been criticised for having somebody to deal with the media, but the volume of requests was incredible, and both nationally and internationally. And it was almost, I don't know how Clarence managed it in May and early June 2007, but it was a full-time job just dealing with those requests. And it's been very important. As I said, we have no prior media experience, but in terms of just shielding us from the inquiries, which were constant.
Gave us a little bit of protection, really.
And, obviously we were working very hard behind the scenes, and let us spend some time with our family as well.
In paragraph 24 of your statement, Dr. McCann, you deal with the argument, or the suggestion, well, here you are dealing with the press, and then in parenthesis, on your own terms. That almost allows the press open season to deal with you on their terms. Maybe I'm slightly over-exaggerating the point, but in your own words, please, what is your view about that suggestion?
Well, it has been argued on many occasions that by engaging, then it was more or less open season, and I think it's crass and insensitive to suggest that by engaging with a view to trying to find your daughter that the press can write whatever they want about you without punishment.
Now, the next section of your statement deals with accuracy of reporting, and you point out that after a period of time there was little new news to report.
Yeah.
It may be at that point that the agenda started to morph, and in paragraph 27 you state clearly it didn't take long before innuendo started to creep in. Are you able to elaborate on that if you were to wish to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were two elements. The reporting quickly became highly speculative, and often stories, for example, there must have been McCann fury on the front page of many newspapers over that summer that would quote an unnamed source or friends, and unless our phones were hacked, which I don't think they were, then these were made up because they were simply not true. So there was clearly pressure to produce a story. The reporters who were based in Praia da Luz, first thing they did each day was get the Portuguese press, get it translated, and decide what they were going to write about. And I don't think any of it was helpful.
The date you give for the shift of the emphasis of the media reporting is about June 2007. Is it then you feel the mood may have been moving or turning a bit in the British press, or perhaps a bit later than that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I think we've realised that if you're in the spotlight for anything, then not everything that's going to be written about you is either going to be sympathetic or supportive. So we quickly saw that what we thought maybe a good thing to do would be criticised, whether it be our decision to go to Rome or not. Was criticised in certain quarters. Even at the time, for us, it was very important to us. So there was that element, and then there were more sinister elements which were starting to creep into the reporting. Firstly, the first really bad thing was an article that was written in a Portuguese paper which was entitled Pact of Silence, and was starting to refer that there was some sort of sinister agreement between us and our friends to cover up what had happened. And I thought that was rather ludicrous, considering that we were all acting under judicial secrecy and couldn't speak about the details of the event. But that was probably towards the end of June 2007 and slowly deteriorated through July, culminating in September 2007.
Well, the real spate of offensive and objectionable material, and I can be forgiven for using those epithets, really starts in September 2007 and runs on to January 2008, and we'll be looking at those at a moment. But in paragraph 32, you make the general point that UK press articles were often based on bits and pieces picked up from Portuguese articles, and those transmuted from supposition into fact. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the articles that springs to mind actually was a piece in a Portuguese newspaper where somebody talking to the prosecutor and was asking what he thought had happened, and there was a quote saying they didn't know whether Madeleine was alive or dead, and I think the following line was probably dead, and that translated into the front page of the Daily Mirror with a photograph of Madeleine with the headline "She's dead," which we saw at 11 o'clock at night as we're trying to go to bed. And obviously that was one of the most distressing headlines that is presented as if it's factual, and it was just taken from a supposition, I don't know, probability. It was incredible.
One key event in this narrative is you becoming, if I pronounce it right, arguido under Portuguese law, which occurred on the 7th of September 2007, and this is paragraph 34 of your witness statement. To be clear about it, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, because you know more about this than me, arguido does not mean suspect. It means person of interest. Is that right?
That is what we were advised was the closest correlation or translation within UK law at the time, and I think it is probably important to emphasise that as a witness in Portugal at that time, you were not entitled to any legal representation. So if the police wanted to ask any question, which your answer may give incriminating evidence, then they must declare you arguido, and then you were entitled to have a lawyer there. And in many ways, you could argue that all parents of a missing child, certainly those who would be the last to have seen them, could have to answer questions like that. So being labelled arguido was not necessarily such a bad thing. However, I will acknowledge that there were leaks by elements of the investigation team which clearly were trying to portray that there was strong evidence that Madeleine was dead and that we were involved.
Well, maybe there are 2 points here. The first point is the obvious one that needs to be stated.